today, the work that you do with the Cleveland Clinic, being the director of functional medicine there, and a 10-time #1 New York Times bestselling author. It's a true honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me here.
I want to know a little bit about how functional medicine became part of your own life and why.
Well, I was always interested in a different way of thinking and systems thinking. I studied that in college, studied alternative healing systems, but I went through traditional medical school. And when I was 36, I got very sick after living in China. I had mercury poisoning, and my whole system collapsed. I went from being vitally healthy, riding my bike 100 miles a day, to not being able to walk up the stairs, having a crisp mind where I could remember 30 patients and dictate them at the end of the day without any trouble, where I couldn't even remember where I was at the end of a sentence. My muscles broke down, my immune system broke down, my gut broke down, my brain broke down, and I had to literally reverse engineer my way back to health. And during that time, I discovered this guy, Jeff Bland, who is a father of functional medicine and helped me think about things quite differently, reframing disease based on causes rather than symptoms or the names we give things, but actually what is the underlying disturbance or dysfunction in the body. And I basically had to reverse engineer my way back to health, and through that I learned how to treat my patients and became a passionate advocate because I realized so many millions of people were suffering and the answers were right there. And all they had to do was sort of cross over the threshold of thinking differently about disease, and we could solve so many chronic issues, not only metabolic diseases, but autoimmune diseases, neurodegenerative diseases, all across the spectrum of chronic illness. We have a very different model.
It's interesting that you talk about the mercury poisoning while living in China. I had poisoning from different Chinese herbs that I had taken to reduce the eczema in my own body, and it's so fascinating where we can think that something is actually really beneficial for us. A lot of times, like with food, this food is healthy for me, but at the end of the day, it could be a more complex discussion. You say that the fork is the most important or most powerful tool. Tell us a little more about that.
Well, I think we have just begun to understand the power of food as medicine, and realizing that it's not just energy or calories that fuel our body, but it's information, it's instructions like code. We can upgrade or downgrade our biological software by what we eat. Put in the good stuff and all the positive healing mechanisms activate, put in the bad stuff and all the disease mechanisms activate. So we know that we can take food and take someone who's, for example, type 2 diabetic, and within a week have them off insulin by using the right food. And they're eating the wrong food, which is causing the disease. By using food as medicine, we can literally cure the disease. And it works faster, better, and cheaper than any drug on the planet. Has no side effects except good ones. And it's available to almost everybody. So we are just beginning to understand that. I think a recent study by Geisinger, which was very powerful, looked at really poorly controlled type 2 diabetics with food insecurity, and all they did was give them $2,400 worth of groceries and food a year, plus the support to learn how to use the food and to follow the program. They were able to reduce the cost from $248,000 a year per patient to $48,000. That's $192,000 saving just by providing food as medicine and reduction of costs, hospitalizations, procedures, and medical care.
That is remarkable, and I think we're going to go so much further with the beginning of this work that's being done around food and medicine and the connectivity of it with the policies around food and the changes that are occurring right now. Can you tell us where you see that going and what went wrong and why are we here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have chaos in our food policy in the government, which is driving our food system, which is driving chronic disease, environmental destruction, problems with education and kids' ability to learn, national security because kids are too fat and sick to fight. So we need to rethink the whole problem. And the way we got here was not by bad intentions. There were good people in government like McGovern. There were good scientists who thought they were doing the right thing, who decided that fat was the enemy and that sugar was not a problem. There was some sort of nasty stuff that went on behind the scenes where the sugar lobby basically funded a New England Journal of Medicine study by 2 Harvard scientists, which they paid the equivalent of $50,000 to exonerate sugar and vilify fat. And that was then turned by the same guy who did that study into our policy, because he became the first head of the dietary guidelines under McGovern. And then as soon as we got those dietary guidelines in 77 and 80, they became the dietary guidelines for the US, we saw a dramatic rise in obesity and type 2 diabetes. We were told then to eat 6 to 11 servings of bread, rice, syrup, and pasta, to eat fats and oils only sparingly, and we followed the advice. We ate less meat, less butter, we ate more cereal grains, we ate more starch. We did exactly what the government told us to do, less eggs, less butter, all those things. And we got sicker and sicker and fatter and fatter. And it wasn't until 2015 when the evidence was so strong that could no longer be ignored that the US Dietary Guidelines Committee recommended that the new guidelines completely exonerate fat and put no upper limit on the total amount of fat in your diet, and also to declare cholesterol not an issue. So this is a radical change from 35 years of bad policy. But it's more complicated than that, because the dietary guidelines are influenced by the food industry through the committee members who are often funded in part or helped by the food industry. And they also ignored huge amounts of data, for example, on saturated fat and on low carbohydrate diets in their review. So the National Academy of Sciences, which was mandated by Congress to review the dietary guidelines in November of 2017, found that there was corruption in the process, that the committee members were unduly influenced by the food industry, and that they ignored huge amounts of data. And in the next 2020 guidelines, they recommended a series of corrections. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time for us as a country and also globally, because here in the US, these dietary guidelines are literally the gold standard globally. And so what happens in 2020 is going to have a huge, huge impact on the entire world. And are you doing different things? Are you working to help support that transition? Do you have a vision and a goal?
Yeah, we started a number of initiatives. There's a Food as Medicine caucus now in Congress. We have Dr. Darius Mazafari and I work with Congressman Tim Ryan to get the General Accounting Office to review all of the agencies who influence dietary policy and food policy, from the USDA to HHS to the FDA to the FTC, regulating marketing. All these different agencies are often working at odds with each other. For example, we support commodity production through our crop insurance or subsidies, which is soy, corn, and wheat, which goes into white flour, high fructose corn syrup, and soybean oil, all which are the ingredients of processed food. 60% of our calories come from those foods. And then the people who consume the most of them are the sickest people in the country. And of course, then we take those processed foods after they're manufactured by the food industry, and we offer them to the poor through our food stamp program, or SNAP, which is $85 billion a year. Probably about 75% of that is only for junk food. $7 billion alone, or almost 10% of that, is just for soda. That's 20 billion servings a year. So at the same time we're telling people to eat less sugar and drink less soda, we're actually paying for it. And then of course we pay on the back end through Medicaid and Medicare for chronic disease caused by that. So the taxpayers triple paying, and all these policies are not supporting the health of the nation or a healthy food system. Not only that, the policies are supporting an agricultural system that's degrading the soil, depleting our water resources, that's leading to desertification, that's leading to increased climate change, because the soil sequesters carbon and also holds water, which protects us from drought and so forth. So we really have all these policies that are at odds with each other. So the General Accounting Office is now going to review all of those policies, look at the impact on the health of the nation, look at the economic impact, and hopefully make some recommendations about how to revise this. So, you know, when you say one person can't do anything, it's not true. We actually are making things happen and moving forward to try to change the policies.
All of the people that are watching this now are individuals that do have real opportunity to make tremendous change. We interviewed Nina Teicholz, who wrote The Big Fat Lie, and she's very involved in a lot of work right now in the same area. And
she was the one that got Congress
Yes.
to get the National Academy of Sciences to do the review of the dietary guidelines process.
she's a remarkable woman. And so for everyone that's watching, we have that opportunity to really have an impact on the rest of our society. But I am so curious to understand from you part of how we've made these wrong moves and these wrong decisions as it relates to, while we understand that trans fats are bad, there are still many, many experts in our society that say that saturated fats are bad. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, the idea that saturated fat was the enemy came out of a very small population study called the 7-Country Study that was done by Ansel Keys, who was a very vocal, charismatic, and convincing proponent of the idea that saturated fat was the cause of heart disease. It also is true that saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol. And the reigning hypothesis is that LDL is the problem, especially since the discovery of statins. So statins led this huge initiative to lower LDL. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And the truth is that for prevention, there is no mortality benefit, meaning you can take a statin your whole life and it won't extend your life by 1 day. If you take a statin for 5 years, 1 out of 89 people will get a benefit in preventing a heart attack. That means 88 people will have no benefit, and there's many risks. And the truth is that there's been no randomized controlled trials showing that saturated fat's a problem. And in fact, the only trial that was done that was looking at a randomized controlled trial of saturated fat versus vegetable oils, it was done on 9,000 mentally ill patients that were basically in mental institutions, which couldn't be done now ethically. It was done in the 60s and 70s. It showed that the ones who had the saturated fat did better, had less death and less heart attacks than the ones who had the vegetable oil, even though those on the vegetable oil reduced their cholesterol. So for every 30-point drop in cholesterol, in LDL cholesterol, the risk of heart attack went up by 22%. So that's the only trial we have. Now there's been reviews on other population studies. There's been 17 meta-analyses of saturated fat, all of which have shown that there's no link between saturated fat and heart disease. There's the PURE study, 135,000 people, I think 19 countries, 5 continents, 10 years, no link between saturated fat or animal protein and heart disease, but there was a link between cereal grains and heart disease, which is the opposite of the information. There's a 42 country study, which is a food consumption study done by those in Europe, and we found not 7 countries, but 42 countries, no link between saturated fat or total fat and heart disease or animal protein, and there was an increased risk with cereal grains and potatoes. We saw many trials looking at this. There was a huge study of 600,000 people, 72 studies, 19 countries. Again, no link between saturated fat and total fat and heart disease. So the evidence is really strong that there's no link. I just came back from a conference in Switzerland, the British Medical Journal put on, and the conclusion of the editor of the British Medical Journal, after hearing all the presentations over the course of the week, was that fat is no longer an issue and saturated fat is no longer an issue. In fact, data was presented that in ketogenic diets, which are 80% fat, the 22 out of 26 cardiovascular risk factors improved, where in the control group, none improved.
So exciting to hear this kind of information. And I think when we think about the food guidelines, how we can create a movement that can transform, because when one person individually gets to experience the benefits of recognizing that, wait, saturated fat is not hurting my body, it's actually improving my health. And so many people are trying to figure out, is there a difference between animal fats, saturated, versus plant or coconut?
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, coconut fat has got high levels of lauric acid, which is the same saturated fat in breast milk. And breast milk, by the way, is 25% saturated fat. And if you listen to the American Heart Association, we should be having less than 5% of our calories as saturated fat. That means we should ban breast milk, according to the American Heart Association, which doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And the reason we have that much saturated fat in breast milk is it's critical for brain development and neurologic function. It also has been shown in studies that saturated fat intake is associated with a reduced risk of stroke because it stabilizes the brain. So I think that we have to really rethink our whole approach to saturated fat. And coconut oil is fine. It's got most saturated fat of any food. In fact, butter is 60% saturated fat, whereas coconut oil is 90+% saturated fat. And the key is that I don't think saturated fat's a health food, but I don't think it's harmful. So it's not that you should have, half of your calories as saturated fat, although there was a study that showed that where you had literally 50% of your calories as saturated fat, that there was no adverse effects, that lipids improved, that the overall profile, not just the LDL, but the ratio of triglycerides to HDL, which is a better predictor of heart disease, the ratio of total cholesterol to HDL, which is a better predictor of heart disease, inflammation levels, all improved by consuming that. I probably wouldn't eat that much saturated fat, but it's been done in smaller clinical trials. So I think the evidence that saturated fat is the enemy is pretty overwhelmingly negative.
You wrote a book in 2016, and #1 New York Times bestseller, Eat Fat, Get Thin. And the findings were really remarkable. Tell us more about that.
Well, I basically wanted to know what the story was
Yeah.
because we've been told for decades to not eat fat. Everybody's still having skim milk and egg white omelets and is terrified of butter, and it's cultural.
Yeah.
And you go everywhere and you see it. People are still doing it, having low-fat salad dressings, and people are afraid of fat. The truth is that I wanted to know what the story was. So I went back to the beginning and looked at Ansel Keys and all the research, and I got convinced that we should not be worried about saturated fat, that we should be eating fat. Probably half of our calories is fat, and some people more. For example, if you're type 2 diabetic, if you're morbidly obese, or if you have certain health conditions, a ketogenic diet, which is 70 to 80% fat, can be very healthy. And that we should sort of rethink this whole approach and realize that it's insulin that's the problem in chronic disease. It's insulin that causes heart disease. It's insulin that causes diabetes. It's insulin that causes dementia. It's insulin that causes depression in many cases. So we have this whole phenomena where we're becoming resistant to the effects of insulin in this culture because we're eating so many carbohydrates. And that flogs our pancreas to make more insulin, and our cells get more resistant to it, like the boy who cried wolf. Nobody listens, and then you have more insulin, which is a fat storage hormone. It makes you hungry, it slows your metabolism. Whereas if you eat fat, it doesn't cause insulin to go up. It helps to release fat from the fat cells. It cuts your hunger. It speeds up your metabolism on a calorie per calorie basis in a day. If you're eating a high fat, low carbohydrate diet, your metabolism is 300 calories a day faster. That would solve the entire obesity epidemic right there. It's like an hour of running every day. So we have tremendous science that now is shifting us from this calories in, calories out idea about fat to the idea that it's hormones and insulin and carbohydrates that are driving this process. And if we can shut off the insulin, we can actually help people lose weight and reverse all these metabolic problems.
Is it possible to eat too much fat? Is there research? I mean, there are so many experts that are debating this topic constantly.
Well, I think what we're learning, and I'm very humbled by being a doctor because you can read all the studies you want, you can read all the books you want, but when you have a patient in front of you and you're looking at them and you're testing their blood and you're looking at what happens, there's a huge variety of humans out there with different responses. Some people do very well on a vegan diet. Some people do terribly. Some people don't do very well if they eat a lot of fat or saturated fat. So it's really individual, but for the most part, eating healthy fats for most people is the right way to go, and getting off of all the starch and sugar is really the right way to go, no matter who you are.
And so I like the point that you just made about, everyone is different. And you speak about this idea of metabolic resilience. How does that work?
Well, I think we've abused ourselves for so long by poor diets that are low in fiber, high in starch, high in sugar, low in phytochemicals and nutrients, low in vitamins and minerals, low in good fats. And we've also been exposed to environmental chemicals. We've used all sorts of medication that's destroyed our microbiome. We have environmental toxins we're exposed to. All these things drive metabolic dysfunction. So functional medicine is about regaining resilience, regaining organ reserve, your ability to kind of be like a kid. A kid falls down, he jumps right up and runs back around. And if you're 80 years old and you fall over, you're not getting up, right? So think about that. And you can actually things drive metabolic dysfunction. So functional medicine is about regaining resilience, regaining organ reserve, your ability to kind of be like a kid. A kid falls down, he jumps right up and runs back around. And if you're 80 years old and you fall over, you're not getting up, right? So think about that. And you can actually build resilience by using the right food, by using the right nutrients, by learning how to optimize your biological systems. And that's something we know how to do, and it's powerful. And I see, now at 58, I feel healthier than I have even at 35. And I know what to do, and I'm able to actually, as my friend Dave Asprey calls it, biohack
Yeah.
my biology so I can stay healthy and vibrant and active.
What does a typical day, like what would you typically eat, breakfast, lunch, and dinner? And if we were writing a grocery list right now, give us some highlights.
Well, I think of the grocery store as my pharmacy. That's FARMacy.
Love it.
And I have a podcast called The Doctor's Pharmacy because of how powerful food is. And I've got the privilege of understanding what's in food. So when I go to the store, I go, okay, I'm going to get the sardines because I know they're full of choline and calcium with the bones, and they've got amazingly high levels of omega-3 fats, and they're a great source of protein and low in toxins. I go in the vegetable aisle and I go, okay, I know that I want the cruciferous vegetables, and I eat those 2 cups a day, which is broccoli, collards, kale. Why? Brussels sprouts, all those foods. Why? Because they are full of phytochemicals. They prevent cancer. They help upregulate glutathione and detoxification. They help to provide magnesium and B vitamins and all the things I need. I know I look for pomegranates because they have all kinds of ellagic acid, which is great also for antioxidants and building your ability to sort of fight the stresses of life. So I look for the drugs in the grocery store that I kind of accumulate and buy so that I can have all the colors of the rainbow. I have all the phytochemicals. I have all the vitamins and minerals I want. And I use that as a way of thinking about food.
I love that it's considered a pharmacy, FARM. That's a great way to think about the grocery store. When we came here, we're in New York, so probably a lot of people can hear the noises right now. But when we came to do this interview with you, I was downstairs actually at this great Spanish restaurant with my kids. And so I have a 6-year-old, and he loves sardines. So we ordered sardines, and it was the full sardine.
That's a
Casamono.
my
And so you get the little head and the tail. So we took off the head and the tail, and he ate the whole thing, and crunching on the little bones. And I'm thinking, luckily this kid doesn't know like what other kids think, that sardines are bad, or because it's so filled with so much nutrition, and he loves the taste. They're his absolute favorite food. So if we can think about the grocery store as a pharmacy, that is so incredibly empowering.
And there's also bad
remarkable.
drugs in there.
Yeah, right.
Terrible side effects.
Yeah.
That are all down the aisles. And you want to stay away from that. I mean, if you can cover over the front of the package or box or can or jar, whatever you're eating, and you can read the ingredient list, you know what it is, fine. If it's a can of sardines that says sardines, olive oil, salt, fine. If it has 37 ingredients and you cover over the front of the box and you can't tell what it is, you shouldn't eat it. Like Twinkies have 37 ingredients, and if I showed you the label, you'd never tell me it's a Twinkie. I do this in my lectures, and not one person yet has guessed what it is.
Wow. So you, as a human, as a doctor, have evolved so much with your own health and your own journey. There was a time when you would eat low fat. Can you share a little bit about how you felt on that diet and how that evolution transformed you?
Yeah, well, I grew up in that era, and as a physician, I was trained that, in order to prevent heart disease, eat low fat. I was a vegetarian and vegan for years. And it's funny, I look back in my 20s and 30s when I ate that way, and I look at pictures of myself, and even though I was doing yoga and running 5 miles a day and eating what I thought was I wasn't eating junk food, I wasn't having processed food. But I was having pasta, I was having bread, whole wheat bread, I was having lots of grains and beans. I saw my body was kind of scrawny and not well defined, and it kind of was interesting because I've seen pictures of myself recently. Someone showed me from way back when, without a shirt on or my bathing suit, and I was like, wow. And I look at my body now, even though I do far less exercises, I'm much more muscular and fit because I've understood that insulin breaks down muscle, whereas fat helps you build muscle.
That's very interesting. So it goes back to the conversation around insulin.
Yeah, it's all about the carbohydrate load of your diet. There are some cultures that ate high carbohydrate diets, like 70 to 80% of their diet is carbohydrates, but they were all highly rich plant foods that were dense with fiber. So the average American eats 8 grams to 15 grams of fiber a day. We used to eat 100 to 150 grams of fiber.
Really?
Yeah, so when you eat that much fiber, the carbohydrate load is very different, and it's also full of phytochemicals and nutrients and other things. So that's different, and also we were much more active.
So today, what kind of diet works best for you, and what are you recommending?
Well, I find if I keep my starch and sugar really to a minimum, and I increase fat, and I have mostly vegetables, which I call plant-rich diet as opposed to a plant-based diet, with using meat as a condiment or condimeat, that I do really well. That I thrive, I have energy, I don't have swings in my mood or in my energy throughout the day. And I've learned how to fuel my body and my brain using high quality fats, so olive oil, avocados, nuts and seeds, coconut oil, MCT oil, fatty cuts of grass-fed meat, fatty fish that's small, that's not full of mercury.
Yeah.
And I find if I stay with that, and sometimes I'll have a little bit of black rice or quinoa or grains or sweet potato, because I'm very active and I'm metabolically resilient, so I can handle it. I just had my insulin checked with some machine this guy had at this conference, and after 2 hours after eating, my insulin was basically less than 5, or was even like I think 2, he said, which is good. Now, if your insulin goes really high after eating, which it does for most people who are carbohydrate intolerant, which is 70% of Americans, because
Really?
yeah, well, 70% of Americans are overweight.
Yeah.
So most people are not metabolically resilient anymore, and when you